So today's episode, in the breakup, it's all about contrasting the fiat standard with the Bitcoin standard. We talk a lot about how the process of these two forces coming into contact looks a little like World War III. And a lot of people are talking about World War III these days. It's in the air. We brought it up here first, I think, of all the public media around there, and crypto and Bitcoin that first mentioned World War III. It might have been on this show that you heard it first. So we were a little ahead of the time. And I think we can be ahead of the times again. And that's about the end of World War III. How do we get out of the trouble that we're in? The show compares and contrasts the fiat standard with the Bitcoin standard and tries to bring some sense of clarity on where we can head. And I think we might be there. We remember in wars, big dates, big events sort of turn the tide. They shift the narrative. They change the way we focus on it. Of course, in World War II, we had Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor motivated Americans to be involved in the war and got everyone on the same team. And who can forget the real big strategy win, the deployment, the unveiling of the plan for the Allies to win World War II happened on D-Day. Where were they going to get into Europe? What was going to happen? And then, of course, we've told millions of stories for an entire generation about the heroes of D-Day and everything that came after. VE Day, another thing about a year and a half later, they had the nuclear bomb about a year and 3 months after D-Day. But all of those come with their own legacies and are really part of what happened after the war in a lot of ways. Their story continued. But World War II itself, the pivotal dates, I don't think anyone would make a big fuss if I said Pearl Harbor and D-Day, from an American perspective, were the two most important days. And when I look at what's going on in the environment today, I see the possibility of a real watershed moment for Bitcoin in the coming days when I see all of what I call persuasion or priming or signaling around the White House crypto plan. The White House crypto plan, if you weren't aware, is apparently been cooked up for a few months now, been getting cooked up for a few months now. It looks like what it's going to be is they're going to direct federal agencies to examine the potential regulatory changes, as well as national security and economic impact of digital assets. And what you've been seeing as far as persuasion and priming the public is the sanction talk. Even today, we had the new FinCEN acting director, Him Das, who said that although they don't see it necessarily in sanctions, it can happen, and they're going to close the door. One of the worries that a lot of Bitcoiners have is that within all of this strategy, there'll be an ESG component, environmental sustainable governance. And that means that proof of work will be targeted as opposed to the other protocols using less energy called proof of stake. And a lot of Bitcoiners believe, and I think that in some senses, we can see the priming around this distinction in the market. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. What this show is all based on is if that is a reality. If the White House crypto plan, which everyone says Biden might sign this week, unveils certain things about Bitcoin that make American Bitcoin holders' relationship with America a little more tenuous, a little more difficult. In the same way that Pearl Harbor all of a sudden showed that there was this not safe harbor, there was a not safe place for Americans to be at that moment, and that fear spread. And of course, we had the famous speech from Roosevelt, the only thing to fear is fear itself. And what ended up happening with that is because Americans knew there wasn't this Pacific Fleet anymore, there wasn't this stability, they had to change plans. They couldn't just be an observer of the war, supplying munitions and armaments. When Roosevelt came to Congress to talk about Pearl Harbor, what he did was offered a plan, which were the beginnings of D-Day. And we're going to talk about our version of D-Day today, in case that happens. If there is something like this, what does D-Day look like for Bitcoiners? Is there a B-Day? And what goes into the B-Day? So we're going to talk about that today. And because some of us come from the 80s, we remember that war doesn't have to necessarily be X's and O's and difficult stuff. Our war is just Pac-Man. So you're going to see our strategic D-Day board. This is us storming the beach. It's the Bitcoin beach. It's the one in El Salvador. But it's a great beach, and it's a lot like the beaches that those heroes stormed in World War II. So what it's all about First of all, the plan, one of the things that I think is a bit ridiculous is this CBDC piece. I just want to get that out of the way first. This is where I can see this whole plan from the White House really falling flat. What I'm saying right now, it might not be a Pearl Harbor, and this might be a reason. But even if it fails to be catastrophic for Bitcoiners, it might be so laughable and so stupid that it might just drive Bitcoiners to completely give up on any semblance of American leadership and regulation and just hit the gas and go and develop stuff. So one of the things I find hilarious with these CBDCs is that somehow people have it in their mind that it's going to curb demand for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Like Eric Wall put it great, oh, you like speculative coins that can maybe go up 1,000%? Well, I've got one that still goes down 5%, but it's digital, it's great. You see, even China, they bet that their CBDC would curb demand and would be popular. And they really believe that. And you hear it a lot. Well, if the Federal Reserve launches a CBDC, well, everyone's going to go to that. They're not going to want Bitcoin. Of course, we're talking about collateral and the use of it. So we'll see. But if that is the plan, then I think most Americans will say, not a big deal, nothing to worry about. If it does focus on energy, if Bitcoiners do feel threatened, if the same kind of thing happened with gold in World War II, where FDR stopped the convertibility of gold back then too. So he said, you can't, it's almost like capital controls. You weren't able to sell your gold in the market to get money to be rich and do stuff. There was a fixed exchange rate. And even if there was an exchange rate, it was stopped for quite a while. So what ends up happening is if this scenario happens and American Bitcoiners realize that some of the energy stuff isn't there, that this ESG piece is going to make the ability for Bitcoin to grow in America questionable, then how does Bitcoin respond to this White House proclamation and law, and how does it win the war in the end? How do we get out of it, right? What's the BDay look like? So I think I have the recipe for the BDay. We've been given an amazing and extraordinary opportunity here with a combination of failures in healthcare and energy policy that we find ourselves in today in 2022. Bitcoin might be able to withstand any attack from the White House and actually pivot to grab huge pillars of the global economy and tuck them under itself in order to propagate itself into the future, which is what a BDay would look like, our version of the D-Day, our version of Bitcoiners storming a beach. So the first one you have right here, I think has been done, we talked about priming and persuasion before, about what a lot of the FinCEN is doing, saying, well, sanctions, you're probably going to hear about in the crypto law. Every article on Bloomberg has mentioned White House crypto plan, sanctions Russia. This is what I mean by priming. So one of the things Bitcoiners did to prime the world through the years is start talking about eating habits, in particular, healthy eating habits. Add to that weightlifting and all of that other stuff. When you contrast that in the health plan that we see coming from our government, a Freedom of Information request just the other day from Health Services said that hundreds of news organizations were paid by the federal government to advertise vaccines as part of a comprehensive media campaign. So a Freedom of Information Act request was made, and we found out, I don't know the details of the numbers, but what it looks like is the federal government used tax dollars to leverage the CDC to promote and buy advertising space to let people know about the vaccines and that they should take them and all this other stuff. So the problem here is not to say vaccines good, vaccines bad. It's that the amount of work that was done in order to promote a version of health. I'm not saying that vaccines were a bad idea, not what we're saying here. It's the idea that persuasion was used by what amounts to a body that's supposed to be playing it even, looking up the middle, looking for any other potential side effect. And we saw in particular with the Pfizer vaccine, they finally released some of the data about the numerous side effects they were, and it was nothing like a lot of people had initially understood. Once again, we're not saying vaccines bad, vaccines good. This is not a show about vaccines at all. It's about what I think we can all recognize, this complete collapse in trust, particularly around healthcare, around COVID, advice coming from governments, and it's, we can say, collusion with media entities in order to sing a very similar song all across the board. That might have been deliberate, right? We can all imagine that it would make sense for there to be a common front in what was perceived as an important war on COVID. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that type of coordination. I think in an emergency, you want government bodies to coordinate. This is something else. This is something else entirely. This is manipulation and persuasion. An open field to private companies, of course, who can advertise, but the balance gets tipped too far when government, I think anyway, when government colludes with the actual producers of a product and go and sell it. Now, I mention all of this not really to talk about the ability or the inability of our current healthcare system to meet our needs. What I'm saying is Bitcoiners already can attack this front on the beach, because Bitcoiners have been, instead of worrying about drugs in the pharmaceutical industry, have been 100% focused on personal health. That is eating right, that is exercising correctly, lifting weights, doing the right amount of cardiovascular exercise. And all of these things combined means that Bitcoin has already developed a culture around health that can actually solve a lot of problems that probably can scale throughout the entire country. So when you see this decrepit institution of American healthcare constantly charging too much, constantly totally in the bag with insurance companies, who are now also in the bag with media companies, who are also in the bag with news companies, and you realize that health is probably not the goal here, probably not the goal. Everyone trying to make some money, which is understandable. But on the other side, Bitcoiners have worked hard on this. And I think most Bitcoiners have found their way to this healthy living, no seed oils, which might be incorrect, but it looks more and more like Bitcoiners are onto something with the amount of shared information around the healthcare space, in particular, how to live healthy. Now, another opening here on the beach, and we bring it up a lot on this show, is energy. Mayor Pete, they call him Mayor Pete, he's the Secretary of Transportation in the United States, ran for the Democrat nomination, said yesterday, when asked about gas prices and what they're going to do about it, Mayor Pete said that if people struggling with rising gas prices should solve their issues by buying electric cars. Now, I used to say as a joke that that would be the Dem answer to, oh, you know, we can't get away from gas. We'll just buy a Tesla. What are you talking about? It used to be a joke to say it as an answer, but he actually said it out loud. In related news, and this was what Clay Travis said, in related news, homeless people should also just buy houses so they're not homeless any longer. And everyone now today is comparing Mayor Pete to Marie Antoinette, the let them eat cake, let them eat cake. So when we look at energy and the ability to pivot and this opportunity to pivot to electric vehicles, we see there's an appetite there. We see there's an appetite in Americans, but the policy isn't necessarily there. It is just go buy one. Well, we've brought him up on the show several times, Onye Nkuzi. He's a Nigerian and probably has some of the hottest takes on Nigerian finance, Nigerian politics, and is a Bitcoiner. What Onye asks is, Nigerians based in Nigeria must look at the crisis differently. This is about the energy now, the same thing that Buttigieg was asked about. North American and European policymakers are rightly obsessed with gasoline pump prices in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war and resultant Western sanctions. They are looking out for their consumers to limit their pain at the pump. But who is looking out for the African consumer? Nobody. Do you understand that we are potentially facing a decade worse than the 1980s across Africa? A decade of economic stagnation. If you even look at US foreign policy on energy right now, the plan seems to be that we're not going to deal with Russia and Belarus, but that we're going to replace those two with the glorious nations of Iran and Venezuela. But the problem there is previous sanctions have actually gutted their capacity. They can't actually drill the oil. It's not necessarily available. It's in the ground, but it's not necessarily available. So those two things combined, no one's looking at Africa. American policy is probably beyond all expectations and beyond all reason not going to pivot. We've seen opportunity after opportunity for the industry to pivot, and it simply hasn't happened yet. we see today that we can probably end, they say we can end a lot of the trouble that we've got with energy by just building nuclear reactors. Mark Andreessen, who I've mentioned a few times, points this out today. This is a Citibank report. Citibank, recent events in Europe will significantly increase the likelihood of defense's inclusion in the EU's social taxonomy. Social taxonomy, that's ESG, that's the social part, right? So ESG. What Citibank is saying, Mark Andreessen points out, he says the plan. ESG funds will invest in defense companies to make the weapons required to fight wars with hostile regimes we buy energy from, because ESG funds won't invest in energy companies. Can you believe that? So what he's saying is they won't invest in energy companies in America, for example. They won't build a nuclear reactor, but they'll buy and now it's going to fit into their taxonomy, they say, their taxonomy, that they can buy weapons, they can invest in weapons companies to go fight wars in order to not buy clean energy so that they can continue to buy the energy from the countries they're fighting wars with. That's actually the plan. That's the plan. That's the plan. So if that's the plan, we add health, there's no plan. It's get another shot, buy another thing. We get energy, it's war here, maybe this, who cares about Africa? What are we gonna do? I come back to the point that if any American, if this White House crypto plan is like a Pearl Harbor and we realize there is no safe harbor, we are not safe in the safe harbors of America, and that energy policy will not allow Bitcoin to spread its wings, the only answer might be to go to Africa, North Africa, the deserts, where it doesn't matter, there's no people. And you can put small modular nuclear reactors in, and Bitcoiners can actually terraform the land there. All of this energy, of course, could then go into these countries that have nothing right now. They don't have energy, and they're not going to be able to buy the oil and gas, and it's not going to get shipped to them. So what are they supposed to do? Like Onye said, it can be worse than the 1980s. Now, 1980s in Africa did not have Pac-Man. It was not fun. It was terrible. And unless we're okay with them going back to what Onye says is entirely possible, we've got to come up with a better strategy. And when I see the people that stormed the beach at Normandy, it was Canadians and Americans. But now when I look at the new beaches, the Bitcoin beach, and when I look at the Gold Coast in Africa and the amount, the sheer number of Bitcoin holders in Nigeria, because they understood the failures of their central bank long before Americans did. So they got a bit of a help here. More per capita Bitcoin holders were forced over there into Bitcoin. It wasn't just, oh, this looks cool, my friend told me about it on Twitter, what is it? There was no choice. This has already been used in Nigeria for years now to combat the ill effects, the unintended consequences of failed central planning. And what you have over there now is a whole audience of people that would see Bitcoin as a safe harbor and certainly would have no problem with the beautiful energy that Bitcoin miners could help create in their areas. So right away, we can see that any BDay plan really can be the deployment, just like we saw mining hash rate shift from from China to America in a few months. I'm not saying we're going to go to Africa and build this kind of capacity, but the minute we get on those shores, the minute that you're in a place where you don't have to worry about a huge government like the United States federal government trying to solve its super complicated policy requirements, balancing sanctions, Russia, Venezuela, all these different places. If you go to a place that's a lot simpler and you just build a nuclear reactor and you show that the model works, you might actually have a BDay. You might actually have a point at which we see that citadels can form and free cities can actually just pop out of the ground wherever one of these things gets planted, and the Bitcoiners that are there can actually start running what amount to safe harbors for Bitcoiners all around the world. And an interesting thing, you look at these international organizations, the UN, Alex Gladstein writes that one of the things interesting about, you got the UN, Wall Street, information asymmetry, credentialism. Alex Gladstein writes, who was supposed to be on the show yesterday, but we'll have him on again soon. One good thing is the Bitcoin community tends to be very patient and helpful with newcomers who genuinely want to learn about how it all works. This dynamic will be on display over the next few years and is totally the opposite of fiat experts who tend to be obfuscatory and territorial. And he goes on to remind us who's in the current UN Human Rights Council. It's Eritrea, it's Cuba, it's Venezuela, it's Russia, and it's China. So you've got these institutions that are not going to tell you the truth. This is not a human rights council. It's not. It can't be. It's impossible. In the same way that fiat experts can't really be interested in helping you save money, and it's impossible. That's where the obfuscation and territoriality comes from. So we see that if these two beaches are stormed, we come to another ghost, another potential win. And Zoltan Pozsar. If you don't know who Zoltan Pozsar is, we've got Pomp, who just reminded us that he's essentially the epitome of the insider or establishment banker. He is generally regarded as the expert on central bank lending rates, the repo and the overnight rates, and everything that's short-term interest rates. He was at Credit Suisse, the Treasury Department. This guy's all up and down New York City and couldn't be more connected. Whenever people in the bank, I worked in Wall Street while I was at CoinDesk in New York City and spending a lot of time in the New York Stock Exchange and all these places with all kinds of Wall Street people. And I tend to, people, I'm the director, whatever, this thing. I'd always say, so you're a banky whatever. I just gave them all the same title, banky whatevers, right? Because it's too complicated. This thing and that thing, fixed income, banky whatever. Everybody was banky whatever. Everybody is banky whatever in that whole industry, except Zoltan. He's a real guy. You can't say banky whatever. This guy actually, as complicated as this crazy macro thing is, this is actually a person who can keep that information in their head and make some form of sense about it. So he wrote a note that is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And to me says, if we actually get this BDay, if we take energy and actually fuse Bitcoin with nuclear reactors and own the energy and close the circle, something amazing can happen. And Zoltan underlines it here. Zoltan says, we are witnessing the birth of Bretton Woods III. Bretton Woods II was the order created for the US dollar out of World War II. We are witnessing the birth of Bretton Woods III, a new world monetary order centered around commodity-based currencies in the East that will likely weaken the Eurodollar system and also contribute to inflationary forces in the West. A crisis is unfolding, a crisis in commodities. Commodities are collateral, and collateral is money. And this crisis is all about the rising allure of outside money over inside money. Bretton Woods II was built on inside money, and its foundations crumbled a week ago when the G7 seized Russia's FX reserves. He goes on to talk about freight rates, the geo-monetary dynamics, and then finishes his note with this. Do you see what I see? Do you see inflation? When the crisis and war is over, the US dollar should be much weaker. And on the flip side, the Chinese renminbi much stronger, backed by a basket of commodities. After this war is over, money will never be the same again. And if Bitcoin still exists by then, it probably will benefit. That's his last line in it. That's the last line he had. Now, he mentioned the renminbi, and this is where the Bitcoin beach, the BDay, the D-Day equivalent becomes important. He mentioned the renminbi as this commodity-based currency. Something else has to happen for that to actually be a viable solution to solve World War III, US and China dollar. And this is from Michael Pettis. While the Russian sanctions will certainly increase the desire of some countries to have an alternative to the dollar, it wasn't insufficient desire that prevented the emergence of the renminbi or some other currency to be a safe haven alternative. It was the basic conditions of global reserve currency status. And he mentions how it loses the test. It might have been stable during one crisis, but for it to be an actual global reserve currency, it must have an open capital account, remove any capital controls. It's got to completely liberalize its financial system. It's got to have rule of law like Hong Kong had. It's got to have property rights for foreigners, property rights for locals. It's got to completely rehaul the system. So if America isn't in a position to do this, and the Chinese money can't, But psychologically, we all understand that a commodity-based currency is the answer. What we can start to see is that Bitcoin, nuclear-powered Bitcoin, can storm this beach and win the war and end what amounts to tyranny on the part of a lot of these lost and hopeless organizations around the world. That's the episode of The Breakup for today.